My name is Byndon. I'm the chair of the board of Movement Omaha for Race Equity, which is an organization that deals with anti-racism, dealing with advocacy, as well as trying to get people to be much more culturally competent in some of those areas in our community and more so in our state. Today, we have a special guest with us, Davis Bristow, who is an author and historian of local history. He has written several books, and I met him about 2009, 2010, when we hosted a special publication event commemorating Black History in Nebraska, and you all know they put out a special edition, and so we invited him up to the library to talk about that. David shared a great deal about the state historical archives at that time and also things he was working on, and also his love for Nebraskan history. We're also sponsored, by the way, a special historical event on October the 4th, focused on North Omaha Black history. We're going to look at Adam Fletcher Sass' book and so on. And again, it's all related to this conversation. By the way that I got Davis' book is my white neighbor. I'm always using race because I deal a lot with Black studies and Black history. But every now and then, my neighbor who bought 10 copies of his book, hand them out in the neighborhood. He gave me a copy a year ago, and he always asked me, "Have you read the book? Have you read the book?" Finally, I broke down and read the book, and I was fascinated with this book and why my neighbor really loved it, and so on. And I followed up with David asking me to be willing to come on and talk to us more about the book. What is fascinating about this book is its last chapter for me. The book is fascinating in general because I didn't know all the things that happened in Omaha, particularly in Nebraska. But he wrote a wonderful article, a chapter on the lynching of George Smith, African American by a white mob that happened way back in the day. And I didn't know much about that. I knew about Will Brown, but not George Smith. And also, in looking at Davis' book, he talks about corruption and the evolution of the city of Omaha and things that we oftentimes don't know unless we go back and look at archival material, look at old newspapers. Davis' book raised many issues and conditions that existed back then. Some existed today. But again, he had a great deal to share in that book that I was really elated and wanted to have him to talk more about that. Before we get into that, Dave, I wanted you to share a little bit more about yourself. And then I'm going to go into that first question I asked you about the relationship between the state historical science and so on, and then we'll get into the so on. So, David, share a little bit more of who you are.
Um, yes, well, I edit the publications for the Nebraska State Historical Society. We have a quarterly journal called Nebraska History. I've written 4 books. This book that we're going to be talking about this evening, um, this fall is actually 25 years since it
Wow.
was published. That went by fast. That was written before I had anything to do with the State Historical Society. I've been working as an editor for many years at different publications. Um, so yeah, a lot of what I do, I mean, I work with historians to publish their work. I do some research and writing on my own, and it's been my pleasure over the past, I think I've been in Nebraska since 1992, originally from Iowa. Um, but it's been my pleasure to learn about this state over the years and to be in contact with people who are also interested in learning about the state and learning from them, learning from other people,
Good.
and asking a lot of questions along the way.
Good. I'm familiar with Iowa. What town are you from in Iowa, city in Iowa?
Des Moines.
Okay. We know the cities and towns around the Midwest, so I always like to mention that. Now, getting my first question I want to ask you is the relationship between the State Historical Society and the foundation, because oftentimes people get that confused. Talk to me about that.
Yes, the Nebraska State Historical Society is a state agency founded in 1878. So we're part of state government. The Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation is also quite old, not quite as old, I think 1942, if I remember correctly. But they are a nonprofit organization, a 501c3. So separate organizations, but they exist as a fundraising organization. So they raise money for historical society projects, and they also support local historical organizations around the state. So they do a tremendous amount of good from, in every corner of the state. They've supported a lot of things. They've supported books that we've published, exhibits, a lot of different programs. And they have a grant program working with small historical organizations on very specific projects, which has been very, very effective. Um, over the years that they've been doing that. So a lot of good folks there. We really appreciate their work.
You know, when we read your book, in terms of, we looked in terms of the political climate in Nebraska in the late 1800s and so on, which most of us don't know about what happened before statehood. And also, my question up front is, what motivates you to write the book? As we said in a religious circle, what was your aha or your epiphany that made you start to compile this book or pull it together?
Um, I'd started out in the publishing world working for an educational publisher, and that got me interested in the company I worked for in Chicago. Did a series of American history books that was, for a popular audience, more kind of an easy read sort of a thing, and that got me interested in thinking about presenting history to a general audience. I was not from Nebraska, and so before I wrote this book, I was learning more about the state, learning more about Omaha, and I read, the existing books, and I thought, well, I find this stuff interesting, but a lot of people I know wouldn't dig into this, and so my idea was, I want to write a book of Omaha history for people who don't think that they like history.
Mm.
And I'm going to approach it. I'm going to tell stories, but the stories will be factual and it'll be footnoted and scholarly, but I'm going to give it kind of a sensational title, and I'm going to focus on sorts of things that I figure most people will want to hear about. And so it's kind of a sneaky approach to history that, it'll be good for you. You'll learn a lot of good things along the way, but it's going to be a good read. That was
a little sneaky title, kind of like he caught my eye, apparently caught my neighbor's eye. As someone who was born in Nebraska, I'm surprised at the lack of educational institutions who don't teach much about the state history, and particularly in communities of color. In your opening chapter, you describe the conflict in the designation of Omaha versus Lincoln as the state capital, and that conflict, and I didn't know it was that intense. Where did you find the articles, and would our state be different if the capital was in Omaha?
Oh, I imagine it would be. Where I found the articles, well, first of all, I started out by reading, the standard history books, History of Nebraska by, James Olson and Ron Noggle. I think it was an earlier edition at that point, and some of the books about Omaha and things like that. So that's where I kind of heard the first part of a lot of these stories. And then, I would go into the older sources, spent a lot of time, this is the late 90s. I'm working on this. This is before anything was digitized. So I spent a lot of time downtown at the library looking at microfilm, looking at the old newspapers, or going to the Douglas County Historical Society, finding, the old archives, getting back to what people said and wrote at the time. And that was one of the interesting stories is, how Omaha was the territorial capital, how they maintained that status for many years, in the 1850s up to the time of statehood in 1867, by a combination of bribery, parliamentary maneuvers, sometimes physical intimidation.
Right, fights and so on.
So, yeah, so by 1867, most Nebraskans who were anywhere but Omaha wanted the capital to be anywhere but Omaha.
Right.
They really wanted it. They felt like the Omaha legislators did what they thought was best for Omaha and didn't really care that much about the rest of the state. And people especially wanted the capital to be south of the Platte River. That was a really big barrier at the time. There weren't bridges over it at that time. It was hard to cross. And I think most of the people in the early days in Nebraska lived south of the Platte. And so it was things like that that led to the selection of the tiny little village of Lancaster, which had a few dozen people and was renamed Lincoln. And so I think that was an important move in inspiring confidence in the state government, that people didn't have a lot of confidence that Omaha cared about the rest of the state, and this was an opportunity for a fresh start.
We hear a lot of that. We hear a lot of that today. Lincoln and Omaha enclaves, and the rest of the state looks as a level here. In the book, I like the way you describe and expose the racism and the political extermination of the Indians and the lack of respect during those days, in particular, chapter 4, Was there a real Indian problem in Nebraska? Because we think of it as other places, but we don't think of Nebraska as that. And my question is, how did this take place with many of the white homesteaders? Because I know at the same time they were getting free land and so on. But give me a little bit more picture of that, of the Native American conflict and the homesteaders who were coming in.
Yeah, for the most part, by the time you get to the Homestead Act, the native peoples in Nebraska had been restricted to reservations. And so there
In
wasn't,
Nebraska, they were restricted in Nebraska.
yeah.
Wow.
So that process started in 1854, well, or even, maybe a few years earlier. Going back a ways, if you go back to, 1820s or 1830s, the idea of anything, west of the Missouri, well, that's going to be permanent Indian country
Right.
because no one can farm there. It's the Great American Desert, etc. But when they started talking about a transcontinental railroad, um, and people started looking at Nebraska for settlement, then there were, just as there had been elsewhere in the country, um, further east, a series of coercive treaties um, where the various tribes ended up, selling for a very low price most of their land, and they would end up with a much, much smaller reservation. The Omaha Reservation is much smaller than the area that the Omaha people had. The Pawnee, kind of the same thing. They end up in what became Nance County, and then eventually Oklahoma. And so, as much of the state was settled, by the time most of the settlers are arriving, the native peoples are already
Well, and most
gone.
didn't know that. We took for granted they went to Oklahoma doing the Trail of Tears, but that happened more to the west of us, right? I mean, to the east of us. In other words,
Yeah,
Native Americans in Nebraska were on reservations here, but they were not part of that trek. I assume the way your book is laid out.
yeah, not exactly in the same way, but with some similarities. I mean, the Pawnee um, gave up, I mean, under pressure, their land in the 1870s, and then moved down to Oklahoma.
Okay,
The
gotcha.
Ponca, yeah, the Ponca had their reservation, which was, without consulting them, assigned to the Lakota, and then
Okay.
they were told, "You've got to go down to Indian Territory." So they had their own Trail of Tears, and
Wow.
the story of Standing Bear was some of those people under Standing Bear walking back.
Okay.
Imagine walking from Oklahoma to Nebraska in the dead of winter.
Wow. Wow.
Um,
And you described that in the book very well, that whole case. I'm going to see if I get through some of the questions. George Francis Train was a character in your book. He sounded like somebody we all know, kind of a shyster. So why did he have such control of the foundation, the Transcontinental Railroad, and its location? Because again, many of us don't know how the railroad got started in this part of the Midwest.
um, I'm not sure exactly how he got involved with the railroad, but he had already, it's like early on in his life, he had made a fortune in, shipping and transportation. And so he had some record of financial success before he got involved with the railroad. I think the progression of his life is he was obviously, at least early on, very good at making money for people, especially
Mhm.
himself. He set up the system by which the Union Pacific kind of had two companies going on, where they had the Union Pacific Railroad, and then I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Credit Mobilier. It's a French word. He took the name of a French company, and they created another company that built the railroad. And so there was a lot of double dealing where the Union Pacific was hiring the other company to build things, and it ended up being a huge financial scandal, not directly implicating Train, but the point being is that he was the guy who knew how to make this stuff happen.
Right.
He knew how to do the financial dealings, and the story of his career is that it seems like the farther on he goes, the more grandiose his statements get, the more egotistical he gets. He starts believing his own hype. The farther, the farther out of, yeah, it sounds like, I mean, you look at, not going to name names, but various billionaires
Right.
out there who they think, well, I've made a lot of money. I must be the greatest thing on earth. And anyway, train starts sounding really off the rails.
Yeah.
Pardon the pun. Um, After some years, and eventually he kind of crossed the line where people decided this guy's too far out there. We're not really going to
He
do
went
it.
off, in other words. But he sticks out in your book because he's such a character that relates to, as you alluded to, relates to what we have. Now, in your book, you describe Omaha, again, your title, I got to go back to that, where you describe it as a dirty town in chapter 8. And you talked about garbage and sewers in Omaha and so on, and all that. And then some of this reminds me of some of those things that you see in developing countries that have a difficult infrastructure. And I was surprised about the sanitary infrastructure here in Omaha looking at your book. Was it really filthy in the 1800s, the early 1900s, as you described it, or did you embellish it, David?
I did not embellish anything, so it really was that bad. But I guess the key would be, was it, if you're asking, was it really that bad from our perspective?
Right.
Yes. From the perspective of people at the time, cities generally were filthy.
Oh, across the country.
Yeah. I mean, it was just kind of a given that things that we take for granted, like a modern waterworks system,
Hmm.
that didn't exist. And so people knew that streets are going to be muddy. Now, granted, because of the composition of the soil in this part of the country, streets are probably a lot, the mud might be worse than
Right.
in some other areas. But the idea of you've got an outhouse in your backyard and you've also got a well, and you just kind of live with that risk. Well, that's left over from a time when people didn't understand how disease spread. They didn't
Right.
understand,
Right.
germ theory was new.
Right.
Um, and uh, so, things like pavement, things like, all professional fire department or fire safety, building codes, people were gradually figuring that stuff out as they went along. And the demand for better services, or things like, we need to hire someone to clean up the dead animals on the streets, um, because people kept a lot of animals in town in ways that they don't usually do today. But that was balanced against what we still hear today. Well, I don't want my taxes to go up.
Right.
We don't want to pay for that because my taxes are, let's keep taxes low. And so there was this ongoing negotiation between, this is a disgrace. We need sidewalks. We need pavement. We need, we need a sewer system, versus my taxes are high enough already. I don't want to pay more.
Right. It's just strange looking at your book and reading it and saying, okay, we've come a long ways, but it's hard to imagine back then when today. Again, those of us who don't always understand history. I like your behind the scenes look at the way you wrote about the famous the trial of Standing Bear. And why are we not taught the version of what you write about versus this other version we hear so often in the popular media? Because you said yours is completely different, obviously, what we always taught.
People like the other quote better. That's all it is. Um, People know, the famous quote where, we're Standing Bear. Um, he gave a speech. He was allowed to give a speech in the courtroom. Of course, he did not speak English, so it's being translated
Right.
by the interpreter, and says, you know, um, if I pierce my hand, I will bleed, and the blood will be the same color as yours. And well, that sounds an awful lot like Shylock's speech in The Merchant of Venice, played by Shakespeare. And the whole speech that's quoted is very almost Shakespearean, very
Right.
19th century. And when I was going to write the chapter on Standing Bear, I thought, oh, that's going to be the culmination of my chapters, that speech. That's just great. And then I went to the newspapers and it wasn't there. It was a completely different speech. Even in the newspaper published by Thomas Tibbles, who was Standing Bear's friend. And I read the speech that was in the papers, and it sounded less polished. It sounded more extemporaneous.
Hmm.
It's still a very, very good speech, but it's not as quotable. It's not as melodramatic. And so I think what happened is that the speech that gets quoted was first written down. We don't find any record of it before the early 1900s when Thomas Tibbles wrote his memoir. And that memoir wasn't published until the 1950s. And so I think that Tibbles, almost 30 years later, was going off of memory.
Okay, got you.
And um, and so I think, in his mind, the speech got maybe elaborated a little bit. Plus, he had been on a whole speaking tour with Standing Bear, and there may have been some things that Standing Bear said on other occasions.
Okay.
But I do have a theory about that, pierce my hand quote, because it sounds so Shakespearean. Well, Standing Bear's interpreter, and this is not in the book, I just kind of thought about this recently. Standing Bear's interpreter was a young Omaha woman whose Indian name translated Bright Eyes. Her other name was Suzette LaFleche.
Are you talking about the physician?
Her sister,
Okay.
Susan LaFleche, was the physician. Suzette
Okay.
LaFleche.
Okay, got you.
They had similar names. Anyway, she was Standing Bear's interpreter, but she was also an avid reader of Shakespeare. And she gave her own speeches on this tour. She was a powerful speaker in her own right. And so I wonder, and I haven't found documentation of it, if Bright Eyes may have said something like that
Okay. Anyway.
in a speech, and maybe Tibbles, remembered it later. Tibbles eventually was married to Bright Eyes, and they were married for a number of years. Anyway, I think the differences in the speeches doesn't take anything away from Standing Bear. I mean, what he did was heroic.
National.
He made an eloquent case. And so the story is the same. The wording is just a little different.
Yeah. In your book, you talk about some folks think sex trafficking and prostituting happen only in certain areas or in our day and age. But back then, you implied that some of our prominent leaders and people who were city officials that were involved in undertaking had side chicks, use that expression, during that time. How was that political situation reduced from your perspective? Because you alluded to it, and then I didn't quite figure out how they cleaned it up, especially when it was more rampant the way you described it in your book.
Well, I think that the cleanup didn't happen for many years, well after the period of this book. At the time, it was almost like the city was unofficially licensing prostitution, because the women would be arrested pretty regularly and fined, and the city is profiting off of that.
Right.
And everybody knew what was going on. But what happens after the period of this book, I kind of end the book more or less around the year 1900.
Okay.
Well, that's around the time that a guy named Tom Dennison, who started off as a gambler
And a crooked
and
person.
this underworld figure, starts to really gain and consolidate power in Omaha. And so for much of the early 20th century, a lot of that stuff is being controlled by Dennison, controlling the brothels, the gambling. Eventually, he was a big player during the Prohibition era in the liquor trade. Well, he died in the 1930s. And up till that point, up till 1930, he had a mayor, Jim Dahlman, who it's not exactly clear how, whether they really collaborated. But anyway, Dahlman left Dennison alone. And by the mid 30s, you start to see kind of a reform movement and an effort at least to make the corruption less blatant. Let's put it that way. I don't think it isn't like this stuff ever completely went away. But after the Dennison era, things really kind of change.
By the way, there's a couple of books. I think it's a book written on Dennison and his corruption of his administration, and I didn't know that, but out there you can find them, and it just talks about some of the background scenes on that. Now, one of the things I really found intriguing, if not one of the most powerful, is your chapter where you outline the lynching of George Smith, and you put that towards the end of the book. Why is that talked about as the lynching of Will Brown in September 1919? George Smith happened much earlier, but had some of the same things that the nuances that went on. And so my point is, I know that law enforcement tried to stop both of those lynchings, but were overtaken by the mob. But what? Give me a little bit of background about the comparison of the two of those, and how come we couldn't stop that, based on the way you wrote the chapter on George Smith, and also I know you're familiar with the Will Brown thing or the lynching.
Yeah. When I was working on this book, I was familiar with Will Brown, and I already knew when I started working on this, I wasn't sure exactly how far forward I was going to take it in time, and eventually kind of figured out I've got to just kind of end it around 1900 because I'm getting so much material. So I knew I was not going to write about the Will Brown lynching in 1919, but I had run across some very, very brief mentions of the lynching of George Smith in 1891, and I started looking into it, and I was amazed at how similar the events were. I mean, same location,
Wow.
different courthouse, but it played out in a very, very similar way. And it struck me that with the Will Brown lynching, it's like this had already happened. The city had already seen this and apparently had learned nothing
Right.
from the earlier lynching. And the other thing that struck me about it is that, like the Will Brown lynching, it was heavily reported. There were reporters who were out there in the street, and they took very detailed notes, and that enabled me to write about it in great detail. And so, what I wanted to do, I mean, one, I felt like George Smith deserved to have his story told.
Okay. And
And
only
I
learn.
wanted
Go ahead. Sorry.
and I wanted to tell it in such a way that you could see the buildup, that the reader could get some sense of why this happened, that the newspapers at the time encouraged it. I mean, they incited the lynching.
Right.
The way that the mob formed, the way that events unfolded, you learn a lot about mob behavior and crowd behavior when you read these sorts of things. And I wanted to write about it in detail. And a lot of the detail is this is very uncomfortable stuff. There's a lot of horrible language in this. A lot of it's just a really disturbing story. But I felt like this is one of the patterns of history. I mean, we've seen this sort of thing. We've seen this sort of hatred play out in many different ways over our history, and it just felt like an important story. And so it ended up growing. I didn't initially intend that it would be such a long chapter, but it's like it felt like it needed that level of detail. I wanted the reader to feel like they were there because we had, thanks to the reporting that was done at the time, we had the information.
Wow.
To say what happened.
Well, I got a couple of minutes before we open it up, but I want to ask you, if you had to rewrite this book, what would you include today in talking about Omaha, the city on the hill? In other words, what would you do differently if you had to rewrite the book or add to it?
Yeah, I guess there are a lot of different things that I know now that I didn't at the time, and a few things that come to mind. One story that I would probably tell that would certainly fit with some of the sensational things is the St. Paul's church riot from 1895. This was a case where you had a shootout in a Catholic church involving the priest.
St. Paul, Nebraska, which I've been there a couple of times.
St. Paul's Church in Omaha.
Oh, okay. I was thinking St. Paul, Nebraska. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. St. Paul's Catholic Church, which doesn't exist anymore. It was burned down at this time. But the story involves a Polish congregation within a German diocese. And it has been written about in recent years. A young scholar by the name of James Piper, who's from Omaha, wrote an article about it in Nebraska History back in 2017.
Mm-hmm.
It's really fascinating because it has to do with Polish nationalism and immigration, and a lot of things like that. And it kind of gives another facet to what was going on in the United States and in Omaha at that time. Another thing that I would include, one reporter who wrote about that at the time was a woman named Elia Peaty. And about 5 years after I wrote this book, a historian published a book of her columns. She was an Omaha World Herald columnist, and she wrote about all sorts of different things around the city. And had I known about her, I certainly would have been quoting her about different stories. So that's kind of the thing. You write something down and then you learn more and you think, oh, I wish I'd known about
Right.
thus and such.
Well, any writer. We're going to open it up before that. Anything you want to say before we open up to the participants to ask you direct questions or make comments, David? Anything you want to say?
I guess, the main thing that I often say is that one of the things about this book is I really feel strongly that state and local history matters. It's one thing it's important to know the history of your country and to know something about world history. But to know the history of your local place, I mean, not knowing it would be like, imagine if you didn't know anything about your family. You think about when you're able to hear stories from your parents or grandparents or things like that, how you understand people better if you know those things. Well, the same thing is true of a community,
Right.
and same thing is true of a state. And so I really feel that it's important to understand why things are the way they are, and also, connects you to a community in a way. I didn't grow up in Omaha, but I feel a connection
Right.
to the city from having learned, from not only having lived there, but having learned about its past.
Good. At this point, we're going to open it up to participants. Ask David question directly. Go to the chat. Go from there. A number of people here.
Hey, David, are you still in Omaha or have you left the community? And as you've been watching her, thinking about your book and kind of what you see going on in our community in the last like 10, 15 years, are you seeing parallels?
Well, to answer the first question, I live in Lincoln. Now I've lived in Lincoln since 2008. So working with the Historical Society, but so not that far away. And of course, my wife and I have family in Omaha, so we get back there frequently. As far as parallels to today, it's there's a saying, I think it's sometimes attributed to Mark Twain. I don't know if he really said it or not, but it's out there. The saying is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And we often see a lot of the same themes throughout history. It seems like a lot of times as a nation, we're kind of spinning our wheels, on certain things. And this really came home earlier today. I was looking at a blog post that I wrote in June of 2020, after the time of after the George Floyd protests had started, and I was trying to provide some Black history resources that we have at the Historical Society and put that all in a blog post, that for people to read. And I said something at the end of something to the effect of, it was disappointing or disturbing or something of how much of this is still relevant and how much of it is still unresolved. We're not that different from the people who were building Omaha in the 1800s. We still make a lot of the same mistakes, and sometimes still have some of the same good points too. But I guess for me, history always feels kind of familiar because people don't change all that much.
Wow. Good. Thank you. Other feedback, other reactions. And also, if you want to chat, sit them in the chat. You can do that also. By the way, Dave, how many books have you put out? Because I looked on your Amazon page. It's about how many books have you written? 6?
Four.
Okay, 4 books then.
Four that I've written. There's a few others that I'm, like the editor of, where it's an edited volume. But of the things that I've written, I just happen to have them here.
Just happen to put a shameless plug. Okay, yeah. Go ahead, David.
This is the first one, which we've been talking about.
Yeah, that one.
This is a book that's actually for like middle school age kids.
Okay.
About balloons in the 1800s and 1900s. I've been interested in aviation and lighter than air stuff and all the crazy stuff that people used to do, going up in the air before airplanes. I wrote this Flight to the Top of the World about this guy, a real life guy from Nebraska who sounds like a Jules Verne character. He was a journalist, famous journalist during kind of the Theodore Roosevelt era, and was also a polar explorer and an airship captain. He tried to fly an airship to the North Pole, did not succeed. Tried to fly an airship across the Atlantic Ocean in, something like this, kind of like a blimp, in 1910, and did not succeed, but survived barely. So kind of someone who's obscure today, but lived a very interesting life. And then most recently, Nebraska History Moments, which started from when the legislature's in session. I send them an email every day, which is just like a photo and a brief little story. And we end up kind of repurposing these for social media and our blog and things like that. And someone at the office had the idea of, you got to put those in a book and sell them as a paperback. So we did that and published this a few years ago. So that's what I've done over the past 25 years.
Okay.
In terms of books.
Other feedback, other reactions. By the way, David pointed out to an author who's in Texas who wrote a fascinating article about lynching in Nebraska, and I'm going to interview him in a couple of weeks or so on. But it's just fascinating, the history, what he did about how Nebraskans were rejected, African Americans who were coming from the South, how they got pushed back and they were not allowed to settle in Nebraska City and some of the things, and they call them exodus or something like that. So it's one of those things that I'm going to explore later on. Cynthia, you have your hand up. You want to say something to David? Cynthia.
Oh.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. I get my hand lowered. Because I come from rural Nebraska, Clarkson Highway 91, and family out by Grand Island, and I worked up in Wayne. David, I'm wondering what you may have learned about the farmers, the black farmers. It might not be the 19th century, but I know there was a family up around Dixon, and the 1930s is when a lot of farmers moved out of here. But what can you tell us about agriculture and the black farmer who was not allowed? I see you nodding, so I'll end with that.
Oh yeah, well we had Nebraska had a small black population in the 19th century, and even though like the Exoduster movement was more directed at Kansas, some people came here. That was like 1870s. But we have in our collections at the State Historical Society, we've got some, they're actually fairly well-known in historical circles, photos of black homesteaders in Custer County, the Spees and Shores families. And there were a number of others. In the early 20th century, there was an all-black settlement in Cherry County in the Sandhills called DeWitt, later renamed Audacious. And this would be, well, they were Kincaiders. Under the Kincaid Act of 1904, it allowed for larger homestead claims as people were out in the really arid high plains. That community endured for decades. And we've got a historical marker that is out there that was dedicated several years ago. and many of the descendants of those families came for that. Another interesting, on our website, one thing that I've written, an article on Robert Ball Anderson, who he said, and I don't know if he was correct on this, but he thought that he was Nebraska's first black homesteader. He was at least one of the first. But he persisted through, he was born into slavery, persisted through hardships for many years, eventually became a prosperous rancher out in Box Butte County. A cabin that he built is still out in Alliance. And he did this by, I mean, he remained single for many years. I don't think he got married until he was in his 70s. And his wife worked with him on an autobiography. And anyway, he's a really, really interesting person. And his life story shows how difficult it was. In addition to the obstacles of trying to make it as a homesteader, the obstacles of being, ripped off, of, being discriminated against, and all these sorts of things. So while Nebraska never had the number of Black people in agriculture like what you would see in southern states, it was nevertheless a significant population. But it seems like over time, it was kind of that rural to urban trend where, like I was mentioning, the Spees and Shores families, I think that their descendants came to Omaha. And so that was but I guess that's kind of been the trend for everybody. A lot of these homesteader communities, the kids, the grandkids, they end up going to larger towns, larger cities.
Right. Good. Very good. Do we know about that through, there's been talked about that many times in our state history, culture. They were out there. But again, what you're alluding to, there are other homesteaders and people out there. One question, coming back to, going back to your point of how many Black farmers were there? Was there ever a count of how many homesteaders in terms of total numbers as contrast to whites who came here and settled and built homes and so on?
I do not know. I don't have a good number on that. And I would like to know more about that, because it's kind of like I've been talking about individual people and individual families, and in some cases, individual communities, but I don't have a clear sense of exactly what the numbers were. I would think that somebody would have that, but I haven't located that as yet.
By the way, I went on agriculture tour with agricultural folks in Lincoln and Omaha through the Leadership Omaha. And I did not know that there are a lot of families who came here, when coming to use the word homesteaders, all they had to do was just put a piece of something on the ground, and they got all this free land in Nebraska, where again, at the time, a lot of African Americans were still enslaved and they didn't get a chance to do it. But I was just surprised at how many people got homestead land in Nebraska. By the way, Kemi has her hand up. Kemi, go ahead. Kemi?
I had put a question in the chat that I was wanting to just ask. So like you had mentioned in your other books about youth, and I'm just wondering, beyond kind of understanding how some local history helps a person better understand their community, as you said, like what chapters within Dirty Wicked Town would you say are most relevant to young people, and what messages would you want them to take away?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that over the years, I've heard from various students and teachers have talked to a few school groups, and it seems like they've all been kind of at least like eighth grade and up, I think, for reading level or interest. As far as which would be most relevant to young people, I'm not sure. I know that I remember one student asking me about George Francis Train, so I know that their class read something of that chapter. To me, one thing that, because I'm trying to think, that there aren't too many stories in there. I'm trying to think of any stories that are specifically about young people. But I think that, one of the things that often connects with young people is thinking about, well, put yourself in this situation. Like in some of the early chapters in the book, I follow a guy by the unlikely name Erastus Beadle, who came to Omaha in 1857. And really the remarkable thing about him was that he just left a good diary. And his observations are really interesting, what he thought about things. Like, for example, he was at first really prejudiced against the native people. He talks about, the filthy Pawnee, and he's kind of, really condescending toward them. And then later he meets a Pawnee man, and he is very impressed, and he talks about how dignified and intelligent this man was. And then he says, well, I've been finding out that, the Pawnee, are this important people, and they used to be, wealthier and more powerful than they were, but due to various circumstances, they've been reduced to poverty. So he was starting to get it. And I think for young people, you read stuff from the past and you run into a lot of attitudes that we sure don't agree with today, or at least most of us hopefully don't agree with. And to see how people learn, how people in the past changed their minds about things, how people in the past made a difference. I think Standing Bear's story is a great one, because this was a guy who he wasn't allowed to vote. He didn't have any political power.
Right.
But he made a huge difference. Bright Eyes, who was his translator, was a young woman at the time that she was involved there, and she made a difference. So yeah, I think that the chapters where somebody looked at something that was wrong and they made a difference, or they tried to make a difference, those are maybe the things that I want young people to focus on the most.
David, I asked this question of Adam Fletcher Sass, and I asked of you, particularly those who use historical newspaper and archives, how many hours do you spend looking at that information? Because most of us have never gone back and look at newspaper articles, but what kind of hours are you talking? And then secondly, with the technology, can you do that from the place of your home versus going to the Omaha Public Library or library in Lincoln, as you alluded to earlier?
Yeah. Our collection, meaning the Historical Society's collection of Nebraska newspapers, has been scanned. You can view them from newspapers.com, which has made them easier to search because you can do full text searching. And so you can find some things that you might not have found scrolling through the microfilm. But in answer to how many hours, I don't know, but it's a lot. It's a lot. And the other thing is that you find things that you don't expect. There's a chapter in the book, the one about the balloon flight. If you all have read that, when they're trying to launch a hydrogen balloon from Omaha in 1875. That was a complete accident. I had never heard of that before. I ran across it in the microfilm newspapers looking for something completely different. So the newspapers are a great source. They were often really biased. They could be unfair. They could be inaccurate. They could be pretty unprofessional by today's standards, but there were a lot of them, and so a place like Omaha had several competing newspapers from different perspectives. And so you could read the one against the other, and you could at least get some multiple perspectives that way.
Yeah, we call it yellow journalism was a big thing. I see Sister has another question there for you. How and when did the two groups form, Black north of Dodge and south of Dodge, and so on? And what chapter the first name? Beetle. Okay, funny story.
Well, I think that as far as the north of Dodge thing, that was that'd be 20th century, I think, really early 1900s. When you get into the period of time that historians call the Great Migration, when a large number of uh, Black Southerners moved from the rural South to northern cities. Um, and then you see, Black neighborhoods developing in Chicago and Omaha and other places. And at some point in there, I don't know if there was a specific point, but at least by the time of the Will Brown lynching in 1919, like 24th and Lake was very much the heart of the Black community by that point. And so I think in the early decades of the 20th century, as far as like South Omaha and its ethnic mix, I mean, from the beginning, South Omaha was more of an immigrant area. It was Bohemians and Poles and Greeks and other
Yeah.
groups in the early years.
All of them, right? All the groups came.
Yeah. And then next question: what chapter is the first name? Oh, Beadle, Erastus Beadle, Beadle, and the chapters. I write about him in A Journey to Omaha, chapter 2, and A Long Way from Home, chapter 3.
Yeah.
I think those are the main places where he's.
Hey, I want to ask you up front. Sometimes authors are not quick to tell this, but I know some of your stuff is on Amazon. Some is, I assume, is in Kindle. Kindle, and some you buy straight out. What makes you decide? How do you get to between the electronic version of a book versus your hard copy? How did you come about making those decisions for yourself?
Well, it's kind of up to the publisher. With A Dirty Wicked Town, I mean, it came out before there were ebooks, and then later the publisher started getting into that, and I don't remember on the others if they are available in Kindle format or not. I think that Sky Sailors is. But yeah, it's really kind of up to the publisher. You kind of sign the contract and they can, decide whether they want to keep printing something or if there's an electronic format that they want to, issue it in, or paperback or things like that.
By the way, some of the things that come to mind, I know, was it Piper who wrote her book about the immigrants. So she's a Nebraska person. She's real famous, lives in Lincoln, I understand. And of course, your books. I have no clue. What kind of money do you make? Or is that top secret? Is that where you can quit your day job and just write a piece like those famous authors who are on the New York Times? Give me a little background on, are you driving a Lexus or a Mercedes or whatever? How does that work with writing books versus working full time? And then you don't have to put too much detail, show you disclose your tax returns to me, but help me understand what kind of income are we talking when you write books?
Not much, especially when you're writing like local history. The market is so small that there's no there's no quitting of jobs. I think it's tough enough even for people in the national market anymore. But yeah, if you're writing local history, you're really kind of hoping that you make enough money to pay for for the money you spent doing the research on it. So you really kind of have to do it for the love of the thing.
Okay, gotcha.
Not for the income. I mean, I am really happy that A Dirty Wicked Town has remained in print for 25 years.
Wow.
But no, that's not now you can retire. But it did do some good things for me in that it led to other projects. It led to other things, and so that was good. It led to other work.
Good. Other questions, other feedback, other folks. We got about 5 minutes left, or about 4. So
I just want to say thank you for the beetle. I spelled it like a bug, but I think that would make a good children's book.
Oh, his story?
Right, because like you said, it was a long way from home, especially as we deal with our own world now, which just the population of our immigrants, second generation, you know, yeah, and the changes in the young man's attitude as he faced a Pawnee and actually saw them as a human being. So I
Yeah.
thank you for that. And maybe there's somebody who writes children's books, or maybe you will.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, his Beatles diary was later published as a book, not as a children's book, but just the diary itself, under the title "Ham, Eggs, and Corn Cake." Um, the historian Ron Noggle, who wrote the History of Nebraska, edited the diary, and University of Nebraska Press published it um, some years ago. But yeah, no, I hadn't thought about a kids book version of his story, because he was from upstate New York, I think, and so he was way across country, and he was missing his family, and he was trying to make it as a land speculator and all of this stuff, and it just didn't work out for him. But then he went back home, and he later became quite wealthy publishing dime novels. Um, so he had an interesting life.
Hey, we're coming close to the end here. I wanted to give you a chance. Any closing comments before we fade out and move on? Anything you want to say to the participants today and the viewing audience on Facebook Live and elsewhere?
Um, Thank you so much for being part of this and listening to me. And I would just encourage everyone, try to dig into the stories of wherever you are, whether it's your family, your neighborhood, your city. There's probably resources out there. I mean, if it's Nebraska history, history.nebraska.gov, we've got a lot of stuff on our website. Um, and if you're interested in those things, there's going to be people out there who share that interest. And I think that's a great way to build community, is to learn about the backstory of that community.
I appreciate that. I want to close out by saying thank you, David, for being here today and allowing us to share your book with our audience and so on. And we also know a lot of folks get a chance to watch this later. But I want to say we're going to continue to talk about history, because we know history is very important for those of us as a people who have had some of that history replaced or ignored or somewhat whitewashed. And we live in a time where history is important. And I just saw a piece today by Adam Fletcher Sass why he writes about history. And history can help give us a grounding in who our families are, our ancestors, and I hope to get a chance to talk to some of the genealogists at the University of Nebraska, as well as Omaha Public Library, about how we can help more families to study their history. And one of the things we get caught in that notion is, can we look at today's value based on yesterday's value or beliefs? But again, these are conversations those of us who calls ourselves budding historians we need to be talking about. But as David alluded to earlier, that there's a little flavor that happened in the past. We sometimes don't always understand what's happening today because we don't know our history. And the last point I want to raise, and I think it's probably the most important, I learned this when I was in Africa. My wife used to say, late wife used to say, remember the name. We mean the kids leave the house. Remember you belong to someone, you belong to a group, and you cannot embarrass your family and so on, because you are part of that tribe or that clan, or however we would say, clan with a C, that is, that we need to be about. And so as we become closer together, hopefully to bring our worlds together as a family, as a community, some of us have to stand tall and remind folks about the history, that we've not always come that far, but there are times we have in some areas. And I would hope that you would continue to tune in, to watch us, to engage us, and challenge the conditions that we face as Nebraskans. And again, it's very important for us to, again, to know our history. So, David, on that note, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll get a chance to interact with you again, and then the work that you do, and also to bring more people to reading and writing and understanding their histories so they can remember their past. So on that note, we'll always end by saying, may the force be with you. Baroko.